Hello, my name is Stan from EnglishExplained.es, and today we are going to review the auxiliary verbs. Now, keep in mind that usually you learn how to use them on your way through the beginner English courses, but you learn them separately. So I wanted to create a lesson where the student would be able to see them, at least the three most important ones at this stage, to see them together and to see some extra context about them. I know there are many auxiliary verbs, for example, there are modal auxiliary verbs, but we're going to leave them out today because I want to focus on the auxiliary be, the auxiliary do, and the auxiliary have. After this lesson, remember to go to EnglishExplained.es, and there you will find the review of this lesson as well as some exercises to practice everything you learn in this lesson. So without waiting any longer, let's get into the lesson. So as an English student goes through the grammar, he quickly realizes that the auxiliary verbs are quite important. And that is because the auxiliary verbs are used in many mechanisms in the English language. Started with the time tenses, with the building of questions, the negative statements, the affirmative statements. We also use them in question tags, the short answers, to show emphasis on some specific information in a sentence, and we also use them to avoid repetition. But that's something we'll see in more advanced lessons, so do not worry about that for now. Most of my students are quite comfortable just giving a few examples of the auxiliary verbs. But when I ask them to tell me the definition, when I ask them what are those auxiliary verbs, that's when you see that horror expression on their faces. So I'm going to tell you what they are just in a moment. But first, let's take a look at them in context. So by now you should be already familiar with at least six kinds of verbs. Firstly, there are the action verbs and the state verbs, which are basically what the name tells us. The action verbs express an action, and the state verbs express a state. The curious part about them is that state verbs are rarely used in continuous tenses. This is something you learn when you first study present simple and present continuous tenses. Then there are those annoying irregular verbs which simply don't follow the grammatical rules. So that's what defines them. Then you also have the modal verbs and the phrasal verbs. The modal verbs express a modality of a sentence, and phrasal verbs are the verbs which are composed by more than two words. And lastly, we have the auxiliary verbs. So the auxiliary verbs are the helping verbs. They accompany the main verb. An auxiliary verb adds functional grammatical meaning to the clause in which it appears, which is tense, aspect, modality, voice, emphasis, and etc. And let me warn you, do not try to translate these verbs into your language. That is because they don't have a meaning. They don't mean anything, they simply carry a context. And let me explain with an example what I'm trying to say here. Look at this sentence. He is running. Very simple sentence. So the verb running is telling you that we're talking about an action which means walking much or simply faster than usual, and the auxiliary is here to tell us the following. Because I am placed after the subject and I don't have a not after me, this sentence is affirmative. And because I'm followed by a gerund and I am in a present tense, this sentence is in present continuous tense, meaning we're talking about an action that is happening at the moment of speaking. Still confused? That's not surprising. Don't worry, it will be much clearer by the end of the lesson. So let's take a look at the main three auxiliary verbs: be, do, and have. So the verb be is the most common verb in the English language, and it can be used as an auxiliary verb and as a main verb. So we have its base form, which is be, its present forms, which are am, is, and are, its past forms, which are was and were, its present participle, or also known as gerund form, being, and its past participle form, which is being. Let me show you some examples of the verb to be as a main verb of a sentence. So for positive sentence, we'd say they are 20 years old. For negative sentence, we would say they are not 20 years old. And for question, we would say, are they 20 years old? But then we, as an auxiliary, we use the verb be in continuous tenses. Quick question, do you remember why we use continuous tenses? Pause the video and try to answer that question before you continue. Okay, in case you weren't able to remember that, you have the answer on the screen right now. Good. So let's see some examples of be in its progressive forms, also known as continuous forms. Example number 1, present continuous. He is playing football, or he is learning English. Example number 2, past continuous. He was playing football, or he was studying English. Example number 3, present perfect continuous. He has been playing football, or he has been learning English. And the last example, past perfect continuous. He had been playing football, or he had been studying English. We also use the auxiliary be to create passive forms. Let's go for another quick question. Do you remember why we use passive? Don't worry if you don't. I'm not going to give you the answer in this video because we will speak about the passive form in the future videos. But I'm going to give you just few examples. Example number 1, the house is built by his family, or the house was built by his family. Another example would be the house has been built by his family. And lastly, in the future, would say the house will be built by his family. The verb do is also one of the most common verbs in English language. It can be used as an auxiliary and as a main verb. And as an auxiliary, it is often used in questions and negative sentences. So some examples of negative sentences are, I do not know the truth, she doesn't like me, and they didn't bring the food. For questions, do you want to have another drink? Did he finish his homework? Do we need to keep going straight? Do we need to go to school? Well, you know the answer. But sometimes you will also see the auxiliary do used in affirmative sentences. And in those cases, we use it specifically to emphasize the information, to give it stronger meaning than usual to the information we're given in the sentence. For example, I do know the truth. Now, you're going to be surprised, but the verb have is also one of the most common verbs in the English language. And when it's not used as the main verb, as the full verb of the sentence, we use it as the auxiliary to create the perfect tenses. Yes, another quick question. Do you remember why we use the perfect tenses? And do not worry if the answer to this question is no, because we will review the perfect tenses in the future lessons from EnglishExplained.es. But for now, let's take a look at a few examples of the auxiliary have in the perfect tenses. Number 1, present perfect simple. He has played football. He has played football. Number 2, past perfect simple. He had played football. He had played football. Present perfect continuous. He has been playing football. He has been playing football. I know, right now you're thinking, we have already seen this example with the auxiliary be. And that is true because in this sentence we have two auxiliaries. We have the auxiliary have and the auxiliary be. And it's perfectly possible to have one or more auxiliary in the same sentence, because each auxiliary has a different function. The auxiliary have is saying that this sentence is in perfect tense, and the auxiliary be is telling us that it is a continuous tense. We see a similar behavior in past perfect continuous. He had been playing football. He had been playing football. Once again, two auxiliaries. There is also another form that we use in English to express a present possession or obligation. It's usually taught at the elementary or beginner levels. In those cases, it's similar to the usage of the verb have as a main verb in terms of meaning, but it uses different grammatical rules. So for obligation, we'd say, I have to wear the uniform to work, or I've got to wear the uniform to work. Some similar examples for questions would be, do you have to wear the uniform to work? Or have you got to wear the uniform to work? And the negative would say, I don't have to wear the uniform to work, or I haven't got to wear the uniform to work. And we can also express a possession. And for possession, we'd say, I have got a dog. I haven't got a dog. Have you got a dog? And then we could also simply use the verb have. I have a dog. I don't have a dog. And do you have a dog? So this is it for today. If you still have any questions, you can go to EnglishExplained.es and post your question in the comment section, and I will do my best to answer as many questions as I can. Remember to keep practicing your English, to keep improving, and most importantly, remember to subscribe to this channel if you're still not subscribed, and you can even give a like to this video just to give me some support. So see you soon, friends. Until our next lesson. Bye.